Welcome, everyone. We're so delighted to be gathered today in this discussion, this celebration of the ways that food and food production and cooking manifest in poetry. Just to give a quick overview, my name is Sandra Beasley. I helped organize this event. I'm going to be introducing each one of our terrific poets in turn with their bios. We're each going to read 2 poems today just to kind of lay the groundwork, and then we'll have a collaborative discussion for the last 20 minutes or so about what our experiences have been. And just again, joining us today, we have Rebecca Gail Howell, Ashley Jones, and Adrienne Sue. So just to get us started, part of the genesis of this conversation was an anthology that I was fortunate enough to edit in 2018 for the University of Georgia Press. That anthology is called Vinegar and Char, Verse from the Southern Foodways Alliance. And it was a celebration of 20 years of SFA symposiums. And they invited me to both work with the poets and contributors with whom the organization was already affiliated, and then also to cast a wider net to kind of check out, see who was writing now, who maybe 15 years earlier had not been on SFA's radar. And that was a terrific opportunity to kind of bring people to the foreground whose voices needed to be heard, not just amplifying the discussion of Southern foodways, but complicating it, I would say, inviting in more cultures, more kind of traditions, and not hewing to a particular archetype of what Southern cuisine might look like. So I'll break the ice by reading. I'm going to keep my bio note very short. I'm the author of 4 poetry collections, most recently Made to Explode, which came out in February of this year. Both the poems I'll read are from that collection. I live in Washington, D.C., and the only other book that I have is a book on food allergies, ironically, a disability memoir called Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, Tales from an Allergic Life. One of the delights of working on other people's food poems is that you start thinking, what are the things I want to see spoken to? What are the interstices and the spaces that I can write into? I wanted to write about a weekly experience with a beloved fast food restaurant of my childhood. And I'll just mention, since this is an opportunity to do so, just a little context. This was actually the place that I would go to every week after my allergy shot en route to my grandparents' house. So ironically, there's I'm going to conflate speaker and poet a little bit here. This is, for me, in some ways, a poem about my grandparents, even though they don't make an explicit appearance. But it's about a very particular window of time in my childhood where something somewhat painful, a weekly shot, was paired with the pleasure of family and gathering to eat together. Long John Silver's. Once again, at the Long John Silver's of 1988, the rope-slung walkway seems to sway under my feet as I look up at the Cape Cod with its steepled roof, trimmed in yellow, and lean my whole weight to the wrought iron sword that serves as a door handle. At the counter, I order a fish fillet served in a folded paper treasure chest with a handful of fries to hide the secret compartment. Hold the hush puppies, corn cob on the side. I carry the blue plastic tray with care to a booth paneled in the mahogany of an officer's quarters, then sit on a bench vinyled like a nautical flag. The batter is always fluffy with club soda, and here no one has died yet. My teeth cut a smile into the Icelandic cod, and perhaps I will go back to order a chicken plank or a tray of crunchies swept from the friar's belly, which they will give me for free. When I look back on all that I've done, I want to be the person stubborn enough to found a chain of seafood shops in Lexington, Kentucky, 500 miles from any ocean, named for a character in a Scottish novel. I want to admit I'm doubled over and howling, yet reach up to ring the captain's bell on my way out. The other poem I'll read goes from looking at the setting for eating to very specifically deep dive on the history and the taxonomy and the origin story of a particular food. That food is pinto beans, which I cooked quite a bit during the past year. All of a sudden, I found myself in the situation to truly luxuriously cook beans from scratch. I'm not gonna call anything a silver lining of the past year, but I will say that I learned a lot about the art of beans, so to speak. In praise of pintos. Phaseolus vulgaris. Forgive these mottled punks. Children burst from the piñata of the new world and their ridiculous names of Lariat, Kodiak, Othello, Burke, Sierra, Maverick. Forgive these rapscallions that would fill the hot tub with ham while their parents go away for the weekend just to soak in that salt. Forgive their climbing instinct. Forgive their ignorance of their grandparents who ennobled Rome's greatest, Fabius, Lentulus, Pisa, Cicero, the chickpea. Legume is the enclosure, fruit in pod, but pulse is the seed. From the Latin, pulse is to beat, to mash, to throb. Forgive that thirst, forgive that gallop. Beans are the promise of outlasting the coldest season. They are a wink in the palm of God. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to turn next to Rebecca Gail Howell. I'll mention, Ashley, that you're on deck to follow her. Rebecca Gail Howell is the author of 2 award-winning novels in verse, American Purgatory and Render and Apocalypse, and the translator of Women Poets of the Global South. Among her awards is a United States Artist Fellowship and 2 fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, where today she is an elected member of the writing committee. Since 2014, Howell has served as poetry editor for Oxford American, where she and her fellow editors received the National Magazine Award for General Excellence. We welcome Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be with you. And I want to thank Sandra again for bringing us all together today to have this incredible conversation, and the festival organizers for making it all possible. It's just a great privilege to be here. I'm going to read from my first book, Render and Apocalypse. As Sandra just said, it's a novel in verse. All you need to know to enter the poems is that there are 2 primary characters, human characters. One is a man who has woken up on a subsistence farm, having absolutely no idea how to survive there. And one is the narrator, who's sort of a trickster narrator. She sometimes gives him advice that will really help him, and sometimes she makes him learn the hard way. I'm going to read you 2 poems, and I suppose you should know that, as you probably already do, that on a subsistence farm, animals are killed. How to Kill a Rooster. Because he spurred you, grab him by his neck and his legs. Hold him in both your hands. Look him in the eye. Let him ask if you are to kill him today. Then tell him yes. Say yes with your own eye just before you take him to the clothesline and tie him up by his yellow feet. Take a blade, cut his throat. Watch his blood drip to the ground. Watch his wings spread and flap and flap. And while you watch this desperate bird and think to yourself, I will never be like him. Remember, in the end, you will drop him in boiling water. Pluck each of his oily feathers between your fingers. Remember, in the end, you will taste him for good. So while I was working on this book, I was thinking a lot about climate change and really sort of letting it come into my consciousness in a big way for the first time. And I was thinking a lot about what got us in this mess and how I might start to write toward my questions about what's in a person to why are we distinct from the rest of the creaturely world that we would make choices to destroy our habitat rather than protect or preserve it. And so this book was starting to get written. And as the poem started to come, what I really felt was true, which is what my teacher, Jean Valentine, said would happen, was that the animals in the poems started telling me that what we've forgotten is tenderness. That's what makes the difference. And so this last poem was the answer I got. How to Kill a Hog. Do you remember how close you were to her when she was farrowing and she needed you? Her bawling drawing you out of bed, a bad dream. You washed her vulva, soft, warm water over your own hands, how you scrubbed even your fingernails under your fingernails before you came to the pen, and sunflower oil you coated yourself in so she would not chafe even as she hemorrhaged, and how against all this bloody shit and hay, you took each piglet out of her night and into yours, into your palm, and cleared its mouth, its nose of mucus, how you brought breath to each set of tiny lungs, how you washed, how you opened her. This is how to touch her now. Once she is hung and cut, straight cut from rectum to neck, while the other men take their cigarettes, find quick coffee, food, lag behind, wait until the barn is empty, until you are alone, then step inside her, your arms inside her death like it is a room, your private room, peculiar and clean. Gather her organs up into your arms like you once did your mother's robes when you were a boy who knew nothing but the scent of sweat and silk. Hold her and inhale before reaching all the way around to snip the last tendon, before you cut the stomach, intestines, kidney, liver, before you cut her heart out and she drops into you and drops down into the cold wash tub of this day. Close your eyes, just once. Do not turn away. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. We turn now to Ashley M. Jones, who holds an MFA in poetry from Florida International University. And she is the author of Magic City Gospel, Hub City Press 2017, Dark Thing, Pleiades Press 2019, and Reparations Now, Hub City Press 2021. Her poetry has earned several awards, including the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, the Silver Medal in the Independent Publishers Book Awards, Belina Miles Weaver Todd Prize for Poetry, a Literature Fellowship from the Alabama State Council on the Arts, the Lucille Clifton Poetry Prize, and the Lucille Clifton Legacy Award. She teaches creative writing at the Alabama School of Fine Arts and in below residency MFA at Converse College. Jones co-directs Penn Birmingham, and she is the founding director of the Magic City Poetry Festival. She currently serves as the O'Neill Library's Lift Every Voice Scholar and just finished a rotation as the guest editor for Poetry Magazine. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you for inviting me to speak and read today. I'm so excited, and I'm excited to talk about food. So I'm going to read two pieces about my dad. I'm thinking about him a lot, of course, because his body has left us, but his spirit is now here. So the first piece is from my second book, which is called Dark Thing. And it's about a particular food that my dad used to eat with me I don't eat this food anymore. And once I tell you what the food is, I think you'll understand why I don't eat it anymore. But as a child, it was, this amazing, wonderful thing. So this is called Hoghead Cheese Haiku. My dad would slice it over crackers, each sliver a gravelly gray. Hog's head boiled down, too flat to recognize as hog anymore. Now, souse. We ate it. Joy spilled like salt between our fingers, like hog between them. This meal, so special because Dad made it for us, a secret treasure. We did not know these meals, hoghead cheese, canned sausage, rice and rice and rice, told us we weren't rich. We thought, delicacy, treat, what steak could top this? And what magic lies within a pig's head, pig's foot? This unnatural dairy, this gray cheese made of snout, flesh, feet, and heart, congealed, sour art. So yeah, hoghead cheese or souse meat is this very strange congealed thing made up of pig parts. And like I said, I can't eat it anymore, but I wanted to remember, just eating it with my dad, and all of those are little haiku. So a nice little alliterative title as well, Hoghead Cheese Haiku. The last poem that I'll read is from my new book, Reparations Now. And actually, this poem was written specifically for the Southern Foodways Alliance. They had a meeting in Birmingham a few years back. And I'll try to tell the story very quickly, but I wanted to write about my experience with growing food. The theme was labor. So I thought about, watching my dad grow food in our backyard, which he did as long as I knew him. And I mean, it's still, the yard is still here and we're still eating his last crop. And so I wrote about, him. I interviewed him actually, and he told me all these interesting stories about his relationship to gardening and to growing food. And so I invited him to the SFA meeting. It was like a day before or after his birthday. And I didn't tell him that I was going to read this poem. I read the piece and I couldn't quite see him clearly through the audience, but my mom says that he started to cry, which is something that he didn't do often, at least not around us. So I'm just so glad I have that special memory of reading this poem for him and to him. And I'm so glad that I have, the fruit of his labor literally still with me. Photosynthesis. When I was young, my father taught us how dirt made way for food, how to turn over soil so it would hold a seed, an infant bud, how the dark could nurse it until it broke its green arms out to reach the sun. In every backyard we've ever had, he made a little garden plot with room for heirloom tomatoes, corn, carrots, peppers, jalapeno, bell, and poblano, okra, eggplant, lemons, collards, broccoli, pole beans, watermelon, squash, trees filled with fruit and nuts, Brussels sprouts, herbs, basil, mint, parsley, rosemary, onions, sweet potatoes, cucumber, cantaloupe, cabbage, oranges, Swiss chard, and peaches, sunflowers tall and straight-backed as soldiers, lantana, amaryllis, echinacea, pansies and roses and bushes bubbling with hydrangeas. Every plant with its purpose, flowers to bring worms and wasps, how their work matters here. This is the work we have always known, pulling food and flowers from a pile of earth. The difference now, my father is not a slave. not a sharecropper. This land is his, and so is this garden. So is this work. The difference is that he owns this labor, the work of his own hands for his own belly, for his own children's bellies. We eat because he works. This is the legacy of his grandmother, my great granny, Ollie Mae Harris, and her untouchable flower garden. Just like her hats, her flower beds sprouted something special, plants and colors the neighbors could only dream of. He was young when he learned that this beauty is built on work. The cows and the factories in their stomachs, the fertilizer they spewed out, the stink that brought such fragrance. What you call waste, I call power. What you call work, I make beautiful again. In his garden, even problems become energy, beauty. My father has ended many work days in the backyard, worries of the firehouse dropping like grain. My father wrist deep in soil. I am convinced the earth speaks back to him as he feeds it. It is a conversational labor, gardening. The seeds tell him what they will be. The soil tells seeds how to grow. My father speaks sun and water into the earth. We hear him each harvest, his heartbeat sweet like fruit. Thank you.
You all are gonna get a little glimpse of DC right now because there's sirens passing me and I can't do anything about it. That was beautiful. I'm not surprised that he teared up, and I'm so glad that that SFA event was partially a catalyst for that moment. Thank you. So we're now going to hear from our fourth reader, Adrienne Sue. Adrienne Sue is the author of 5 books of poems, most recently Peach State, which just came out in 2021, which focuses on her hometown of Atlanta since the mid-20th century. Her poems appear in many anthologies, including Borderlines, Poems of Migration, The Hungry Ear, Poems of Food and Drink, Asian American Poetry, The Next Generation, Vinegar and Char, Children of Grass, A Portrait of American Poetry, and 5 volumes of Best American Poetry. Since 2000, she has taught at Dickinson College, where she's the poet in residence and a professor of creative writing, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I think you teach a writing about food class there. Is that right, Adrienne?
I do.
I'll turn it to you. Yes.
It's prose, but it's about food. So it's kind of poetry anyway. Thank you, Sandra. And yeah, thank you, Rebecca and Ashley, all of you for those just amazing poems. I'm still in the space of your poems. Well, do I have to think about mine now? But we've been talking. I love how there's always synergy in group readings with the poems about pigs and pork. I happen to have a pig story in one of the poems I have lined up. The poem is about a dish, a Chinese and Chinese American dish you don't see as much as I recall from growing up in the 1970s. You always saw sizzling rice soup. I haven't seen it in a while. Sizzling rice soup may have arrived at tables for reasons other than frugality. Abundance being a plausible parent of creativity. The freedom to overcook rice, then drop it in oil just to see, requiring that neither be scarce. The signature shards, airy yet resilient, crackling assertively on encountering hot broth. Anchor performance and story. What looks at first like loss, turning out to be a profound discovery, as in the tale in which a house burns down around a man and his pet pig, sparing the man, who reaches out to the charred pig, instinctively puts his burned hand in his mouth, and happens upon the central meat of a nascent cuisine. Who doesn't love a good legend with dinner? But was invention ever so innocent? Innovation thrives less on hunger than on time and space. Yet the romance of a favored hole in the wall clings, especially one run by immigrants whose tough versatility seems the legacy of centuries, as if no generation had stayed put, and none of this were voluntary. The chicken slivers, water chestnuts, mushrooms, snow peas, carrots, all the raw materials of circumstance, whatever sojourners could corral from alien terrain. That theory isn't wrong, but it overlooks the original recipe, a concept shaped by millennia and as many trials in a crucible that never intended diaspora. The next poem I'll read is really about a dish I also don't see very often anymore. It was, I think, popular in maybe the 60s and 70s. And by popular, I mean popular more among Chinese Americans. I still think it seemed alien to many friends who came over, but I never knew what to call it. And that's what the poem is about. It's called That Almond Dessert. We must have known it as Almond Float, thanks to Joyce Chen. Indeed, it floated in the fruit cocktail, the maraschino cherries as treasured as the tender white cubes that have so many names. I no longer know which one we used. The nomenclature muddled further by my later learning to say Xingren tofu, which translates to almond tofu, a reference not to what it is, but to how it appears. For similar reasons, or to clarify for guests, we sometimes called it almond jello, despite jello's omission to this day of the flavor. Meanwhile, restaurants may have offered it as almond junket for its likeness to the English dessert made from milk and rennet. Junket having come from the Latin juncata, reed basket, in which cheese was made, and from which the Italian soft cheese giuncata gets its name. All of which is not inaccurate because, contrary to what they say about the Chinese and dairy, there was milk in ours too. This potentially put it closer to pudding than tofu, but its silky texture evoked the most delicate bean curd, which may be why it was also known as almond curd, which confusingly implies that almonds can curdle, that somewhere lies an almond way. In any case, pudding lacks shape and makes a poor reference for a Chinese audience. Perhaps to erase all cultural confusion, the dessert also went by almond lake, as anyone can comprehend a body of water in which something cool and almondy is suspended. Looking back, almond junket is the only name we never used, surely because it sounded like an illicitly funded cruise or evoked the notion of a junk, which made us feel foreign, pertaining to trash. But now fruit cocktail is what gets consigned to the heap, canned foods being spurned unless you seal and boil each jar yourself. And something about a sweet finale aligned with gratuitous travel and chance, promising a destination remote and novel, or remote and familiar, like ancient memory.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am now slightly regretful that I didn't read my poem about the food fed to the astronauts in space because it's called Pigs in Space. So I could have just, we could have all been in harmony, but as it is, we'll carry on anyway. This is wonderful. So one thing that I'm struck by how many different angles of approach our poems take. Let me ask something. It strikes me that the problem or the challenge of writing about food is almost in some ways similar to ekphrasis, where it's like, how do you make the act of reading or writing the poem about the food supersede actually eating or making the food. And so I'm just curious, and I would have guesses for each one of you, but I'm curious to hear you. Is there a tipping point where you get really excited about the poem that you're going to write because you take a certain tact, or is there a way in? I'm realizing now, just thinking about my own work, I think for me, it's often hyperbole. It's almost like going from the actual experience of the food to a heightened or cartoon version of the food, where I can really lean into whether it be humor or extreme, but just something, that's punchier than real life. But I hope that question isn't too abstract. If it sparks any story behind the poem for you, please go at it. Anyone game to start? Yeah, Ashley, please.
I'll attempt anyway. It's a very interesting question. I think my approach to food poetry is maybe similar to my approach to any poetry. I'm always trying to illustrate, and maybe that's not even the exact word. Someone's at my doorbell. I'm trying to illustrate whatever experience or whatever memory that has come to my mind. So in the case of the hoghead cheese poem, for example, I was just thinking about that feeling of eating this, to me, disgusting, like congealed thing. And instead of, spending the poem saying, well, here's how it feels in your mouth, and this is what it smells like, and there's these weird white bits in there that are kind of weird. Like, I thought, let me try to capture how I felt watching my dad cut it, how I felt receiving it on a saltine cracker. And I also use the form. I'm very big into form supporting content. So I thought that the form of the haiku could really help me get down to the tiny cracker or the tiny piece of souse meat or the tiny memory itself. So those are some of the strategies that I use. And like I said, I think they maybe apply to everything that I write.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
I'll give it a try. Sure. Ashley helped me. I think it's about, and maybe this is also the same as with many other subjects, it's about finding that exact right distance from the food. That I couldn't have written the poems about, sizzling rice soup, or I have a poem with, say, Mongolian beef, like these dishes that were sort of all you could get in terms of Chinese food back in the day. I didn't have enough space between me and it. But now that there seem to be two streams of Chinese American food, the one that's kind of held in high regard by foodies and the one that's seen as kind of common, I think they're both valid, but I couldn't have thought about it that way when I was too close to it. So maybe it's just like finding, and you have to remember it exists, at the moment that you have the distance. And maybe that is similar to writing about anything.
Rebecca, do you want to? Yeah.
Sure. I think what you all have already said is just so right, and it's bringing so much up for me. But I think, for me, poetry just has a lot in common with food, in the sense that, for me, poetry is a process of distilling. So that's a bourbon metaphor, and I'm calling you from Kentucky, so forgive me, but it's a matter of taking so much, like history, politics, anxiety, fear, personal memory, personal investment, family, all of these things, and just like bringing them down through a heating process into a moment, into an experience that can be transferred to someone else. And of course, that's what food is too. And as Adrienne just said, we as a people, we can sort of say, oh, this food is high class, or this food is low class, or we can categorize it and make ourselves feel distinct from each other all we want. But at the end of the day, we all have to eat. And so it is this leveling force among us that holds history, holds politics, holds land and memory and family. And when we make a meal for each other, all that's there, all that's there. And I have a friend who's a chef here in Kentucky, whose name is Rita Michael, and she always says, food is love. And I think that that's really right. I mean, she means so much by that, and I think poetry is love too.
Yeah, that resonates quite a bit for me. And for me, the journey to thinking about that was more circuitous, because so much of my childhood, particular foods, I had to kind of really have a great deal of anxiety and fear around encountering. So it took me a minute to get to the food is love kind of phase of understanding. Let me ask something. I've had the pleasure of spending kind of deep time with all three of your bodies of work while I was considering the anthology, and have followed the work since then. One thing that maybe was evident to varying degrees in the poems we read for today is that you do have poems where food is a political topic, or where the witnessing of the enjoyment of sharing food gets laced with political awareness of the self and the self in society. And I just wonder if anybody wants to speak, and you don't, you can reference a poem that you didn't read today, but just kind of think about food as a lever for political action, political discussion. Because of so much of, I mean, just to kind of give you a minute to think about what you might want to say. For me, in Made to Explode, to talk about food meant to talk about history. And that, certainly, like, there's a difficult poem in the book called Monticello Peaches that is thinking about Jefferson's reputation for being a great propagator of various varieties of peach, but of course is considered alongside some of his more repugnant legacies. So I'm just curious to what extent you feel you consider these topics side by side. And I do want to, yeah, Rebecca, I would say maybe you're a great person to start, because I think it's close to the surface in your work.
I'm happy to. I think what you just said is exactly right. And it goes back to what I was saying a minute ago, and what I think we've each been saying all afternoon, that that food is this leveler among us. And we continue to try to weaponize it against each other in some cases, like you just said with Jefferson. And of course, this country's brutal history with industrialized farming, beginning with what we called plantations. So it's at the root of everything we do. For me, with Render, as I said, I was thinking a lot about climate change and thinking a lot about the level of suffering that we as human beings have brought upon ourselves and the creatures in this world. And I was worrying about that. I was walking around Provincetown winter and worrying about that. And by sending my imagination into a subsistence farm that, by the way, is not unlike my grandparents' subsistence farm in East Kentucky, where my grandparents did not participate in the cash economy, but grew or made anything they had. I realized that here is an environment in which I can start to see things a little bit more clearly, where need is not, doesn't carry a lot of baggage, it just is what it is. And that was very helpful to me. I think that there's a theologian, a feminist theologian, whose name is Sally McFaig, who says something like, metaphor is for the human being what instinctual groping is for the creaturely world. Meaning, animals, when they want to learn you, what will they do? They'll send their snouts out, right? And get all up into the world. And the human being knows better than to do that. That's rude, right? But we send our imaginations out and ask metaphor to teach us something. And that's a lot of my approach to poetry. I ask the poems to teach me something.
Great. Ashley or Adrian?
Yeah, I've been sitting here thinking, but also listening to Rebecca. So the thinking was like on pause as I listened to Rebecca. Yeah, politics and food are family. I mean, that you can't really separate them, especially maybe in the South. I mean, I would say anywhere in the country, honestly, because even though the practice of slavery, or the terror, let me say, of slavery existed in the South, it, fed the whole nation, and the whole nation, was built on that terror and that food and that labor. So for me, they are inextricably linked. And in my work, I was trying to think about poems that I've written about food, which whenever someone asks me, what do you write about food? I'm always like, oh, nothing. But I think I have quite a few pieces about food. I just forget. But the poem that jumped into my mind is about collard greens. And it's in my second book. It's about, interestingly enough, it starts in an episode of Family Matters, the popular 90s sitcom, where I see the mother and her sister cleaning collard greens, and it's a sestina, it transitions into me thinking about my mom cleaning collard greens. And of course, some of those greens that she cleaned were grown in our backyard, and, it's all kind of linked. But the political part there is really not about, slaves maybe made collard greens, and what does that mean? It's more so about, I'm celebrating this Black woman and this very ordinary, task that she's doing, but there's a magic in that is not celebrated in the wider world in a meaningful way. Like there's always people who are like, oh, Southern mothers, Southern Black mothers, they're so great, like in a kind of diminutive sense. But for me, it's like, oh, wow, no, this Southern Black mother and all of them are who have helped us survive in every single way. My mom knowing how to pick a collard green and cook it so that it's good, that is an important lesson for me, not just in cooking, but in living. Like, I know how to keep things clean, how to make them taste good, how to feed people things that they need to grow. So anyway, I was just kind of thinking about what political could mean beyond some of the more obvious definitions. And yeah, I definitely think in every poem I write, I know I keep saying in everything that I write, but it's true. It's not just the food pieces that delve into the politics. I really can't get away from politics at all. I think none of us can, but certainly as someone whose very body is a political object in many ways, it's everywhere. So anyway, that's my offering.
Well, I really appreciate that. I also would just urge anyone to dash to go read that collard greens poem. It's like one of my very favorites of yours. So I'm glad that it got mentioned organically. Thank you. Adrienne, did you want to speak to this?
Sure, yeah. And I had the same thing of like thinking and listening, right? And I want to hear everything. Also want to formulate something. I think similar problem, that we all have our political convictions, and it's hard to address them in a poem without writing something predictable. So I find I'm constantly looking for a way to surprise myself so that I won't just kind of make a political statement and then kind of marshal my argument with, here are my supporting reasons and conclusion. I was right. You kind of need to be more creative than that. I think food became a way for me to do that, so that instead of focusing on an idea, I would focus on an object and just sort of see what that object yields. The poem that comes to mind as an example is called Egg Roll. And it sort of begins with this notion, because there are people who will say an egg roll is an American invention. There's no such thing as an egg roll in Chinese cooking. Therefore, the egg roll is fake. Instead of just saying the egg roll is Chinese American, right? Does it have to be one or the other? And I found that the poem took me to the westward expansion, and this idea of kind of moving away from the old country, which in that case we think of as Europe, and kind of shedding the rules that the parent country imposes on the American. But of course, the West is also a very Chinese American landscape. And that's just implicit in the poem. I don't say anything in the poem about the gold rush or the building of the railroads that would have, had so much to do with the Chinese American story. I just found myself sticking to imagery about sort of how do you make an egg roll and how do you make a spring roll? And it turns maybe to images to avoid sticking to ideas. And then what happens, of course, is that the politics are just kind of implicit, which I think makes for a better poem when it works. So, yeah, I think that the challenge is to surprise yourself. And for me, food is one of those ways of keeping myself real.
That's great. Does anybody want to mention, we haven't really talked, this is a much bigger conversation than the four of us, right? I think many of us were influenced by poets who wrote about food, or right now are in conversation with other contemporary poets who to our minds are doing great writing that intersects with this. So, does anybody want to just give a kind of shout out, a recommendation of further reading? Often when I'm introducing people to this topic, I'll kind of run the extremes of I might show them like Leon Lee's Persimmons poem as an example of what a big, capacious food poem looks like, that kind of roams around in memory and brings up the food as a motif in multiple lights. But then, compare that to someone like Charles Simic, where like his little 4-line watermelon poem is just nothing but almost like concision and a punch of humor. And I'm just curious if anybody has any favorite poets who they'd like to recommend. It can be a particular poem or a larger body of work.
I think, well, first of all, this poet I'm going to mention is maybe not, quote, contemporary, so I'm cheating a little bit, which is funny because I'm, poster child for contemporary living poets. I love teaching them and recommending them. But the poem that's on my mind right now, and I always try to listen to whatever is telling me to say the thing that I'm going to say. So what's being told to me now is to talk about the poem Cutting Greens by Lucille Clifton. Now, again, it's cliche for Ashley Jones to talk about Lucille Clifton. I know, she is my patron saint, but I have to do it. But that poem I think is so amazing because yes, it is talking about literally cutting collard greens, but the way that the poem turns, and it's a small poem, let me not turn this into Lucille Clifton, sermon, reel it in, Ashley. But it turns to Clifton thinking,
to include a Lucille Clifton sermon for the record every Saturday.
You say it, Sandra, but I don't know if you know what you'd really be in for. But in the poem, she turns to the bond of live things everywhere. She's thinking about, how from her action of cutting these greens, she can think about how everyone is connected. And I think that's such an interesting way to use food, and it speaks what we've been talking about. It's the surprising thing that Adrienne just mentioned. Yes, we're talking about greens, but she doesn't go to, and then I made some cornbread. She goes to, we are all alive and bonded, even me and these greens that I'm cutting. It's not, a pig. It's not Rebecca's brilliant, here's how to slaughter an animal pieces. It's here's this plant that I'm eating. And look at how I too am like this collard green. How are you like this collard green? So that's one that I would, if you haven't read it, anyone out there, or if you have read it, I would urge you to read it again and see something new in it.
I'm going to mention a couple of poems that are also less contemporary and that the poets are no longer living, but this is just what comes to mind right now. One is Seamus Heaney's Blackberry Picking from his first book. I think that my own consuming of food has become so much more seasonal because I live in a place where there are lots of farms, that I experience that glut that he talks about in Blackberry Picking, where all of a sudden strawberries are in season and you get tons of them, but then a few weeks later, they're just going to be gone until next year. And it just creates this sense of pressure and this race against rot. And I just love the form of that poem. I can't remember if it's written in rhymed couplets. Could be wrong about that, but I think it is. And the other poem that comes to mind well, I think of two poems by Maxine Kumin. One of them, Taking the Lambs to Market, which I feel is connected to the poems Rebecca read, about just the kind of inherent pain of eating meat. And then another poem whose name I can't remember, about growing beans and then walking out and seeing a bear eating her entire bean crop. I don't know if anybody knows the name of this poem, but wanting to save your beans from the bear, but also sort of savoring the encounter, being able to watch the bear. And it just works in this beautiful formal way, as Maxine Kumin's poems always do.
I'm so glad you mentioned Max. I think I look forward to the day when Maxine Kumin's work has a revival. I think she's our secret eco poet that has so much to teach us, and we have so much to learn from her. What's coming to my mind is not a book of poems, and so I'll just preface that. But like Ashley said, when something's coming into my head like a voice, I try to listen and do good. And so the book that's coming into my head is one that's soon out from Hub City, which is Ashley's glorious press. And the book is called Landings, Landings. And I think the subtitle is something like A Year on Crooked Creek Farm. I suspect that's it anyway. Anyway, it's a graphic memoir by my friend Arwen Donahue. And Arwen is the farmer who did the illustrations and render. So that should give you some sense of what I'm talking about. She's a farmer, an artist, and this is her first graphic memoir, and it's a year in the life of her and her husband's organic vegetable farm. And as we've all said all day, we often want food making and food growing to be bucolic, to be easy, to be simple. And it's only simple when someone else is doing it for you. When you're really engaged in the work, there's that push-pull, those power dynamics, those struggles, and revelations that come from them. And this book is full of that, and also just a lot of really beautiful art.
That is, that's amazing. And honestly, I'm so glad to have this yield of recommendations and suggestions. So thank you for taking it in whatever direction best served you. We've got about 5 minutes left. And what I wanted to do was ask for just each of us to volunteer maybe some aspect of the ways our lives intersects food off the page, like not in our work, but I think I have a feeling like all of us, maybe we collaborate on an event series that features food. Maybe we teach a class that sometimes involves food making. I'm looking at Adrienne here, or what, maybe it's a favorite gardening, something. I'm just curious about, I was trying to think, okay, I'm gonna ask this question, what will I say for myself? Here's something almost no one knows about me. My very first nonfiction writing, even before I did some columns for the Washington Post, but my true first nonfiction writing, I was a restaurant critic for a local free monthly paper, The Hill Rag. And I could tell some stories because the elaborate backflips I had to do to offer reviews of, in some cases, dishes I myself was allergic to. It was a thing. My family was like my volunteer tasters for a while. So that is the random factoid about me that you might not know, having to do with my life with food. Does anybody have something similar, just like a fun experience? Or, I'm also a great connoisseur of French fries. I have very strong opinions about French fries. So if you ever need to talk with me about not poetry, we can discuss the art of the French fry.
Well,
go ahead, Rebecca.
I want to hear from both of you, so we have time.
Well, I was just going to try to jump in because I probably have the least to offer here. I write about food. I definitely have never done food reviewing, but I have a frustrating food allergy. Maybe that's something I should share. I'm allergic to shellfish. However, that also means I'm allergic to fish who eat shellfish, or anything that's like a byproduct of shellfish. So there's a lot of interesting situations I find myself in when traveling, to give readings and, whatever, like it becomes very difficult, and I have not yet written about it. So maybe this is me realizing that a poem needs to be written about this allergy, because it's horrible. It's not, I wish that it was just, oh, I get itchy, but my throat actually closes up, which is not fun. So that's my weird thing. If you want to talk about anaphylaxis, I'm your girl. So that's mine.
Well, we could definitely have that conversation, maybe not in this panel, but I have to admit, one of my private victories was that I did manage to find a poem that mentions food allergies for vinegar and char. Vivi Francis's amazing poem, Salt, which is about watermelon, among other things. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, it's an odd thing, but I watch for wherever I go. So thank you for that. Adrian, Rebecca, anybody want to jump in?
I'll just, I want to say three things. One, I want to circle back around to the beginning and give another shout out to your Long John Silver's poem. There's not enough poetry in the world thinking about fast food, and fast food has been such an enormous force in this country. And I also want to say that my daddy worked for Captain D's, the rival of Long John Silver's. And so I grew up eating lots of Captain D's. Two, I just finished a workshop last fall for the Apple Shop in East Kentucky that was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts to teach storytelling and to gather stories from food growers. And that was just so much fun. I learned so much from the people who were in that workshop with me about all the family secrets about how to bring food up out of the soil. Like Ashley was saying, those particular details are just so dynamic. And then the third thing is Wida, who I mentioned earlier, the chef, Wida Michael. She and I collaborated last summer on a series of dinners at her restaurant, the Holly Hill Inn, where I picked a poem, and then her and her team would build a whole menu, I think a 4-course, 5-course meal around that poem, and the two were brought together. And that was super fun. Wida's mother was a poet. And so it's always great to collaborate with her.
Thank you.
I'll be brief. I once put down a deposit on culinary school and then didn't go.
Wow, that is a longer conversation. Okay. But you also sometimes do kind of informal cooking classes through the Dickinson community, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're very informal, so I don't claim to have any professional chops. It's just, well, here's what I know in case it's useful for someone.
Wow. I just want to thank everyone, but not just with this most recent round of questions, but with all the conversational turns today. Just thank you for your openness, your immense talent, your enthusiasm for this topic, and your generosity of time. It really just means so much to me. I want to encourage folks to buy each of the new books by these authors, the forthcoming books, the books past. If you're interested in Southern foodways, I personally am a fan of vinegar and char. I'll also mention that they've just made a round of announcements for their upcoming fall symposium. I believe the topic is the food and the environment. And I don't know if she's doing poetry or nonfiction, but I know Amy Nizuka-Matadel is one of the featured writers. So that'll be a terrific event. I just want to thank again the 1455 Festival for hosting us, our session hosts, Sean, and all of the organizers. And we'll leave it at that. I hope your day of festival events is just beginning. Again, my name is Sandra Beasley. I want to thank Adrian, Ashley, and Rebecca, and just wish you all well.